April 1951. The Korean night is thick with the scent of burning pine and the sharp tang of gunpowder. In the shadowed Capyong Valley, the world is about to change forever. Imagine being there, thousands of miles from home, pressed flat against the freezing earth, heart pounding as the darkness pulses with the sound of distant drums. Suddenly, a flare explodes overhead, turning night into blinding day for a single, unforgettable moment. And in that flash, you see it. The hillside is alive, moving, crawling with an unstoppable tide of enemy soldiers. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands, an entire army, surging forward like a living wave, bugles screaming, drums pounding, the ground itself shaking beneath their boots. This isn't a scene from a Hollywood war movie. This is real. This is the moment when two small groups of soldiers, Australians and Canadians, found themselves standing alone in the path of a Chinese force so massive, so relentless, that even the most hardened American commanders doubted anyone could survive. The odds were impossible. The math didn't add up. But what happened next would become one of the most astonishing chapters in the entire Korean War, a story of courage, sacrifice, and a brotherhood forged in fire. Why does this matter to you? Because the Battle of Kapyong wasn't just another forgotten clash in a distant land. It was a turning point that helped decide the fate of South Korea, shaped the future of the Cold War, and sent shockwaves all the way to Washington, D.C. The decisions made in those desperate hours would influence U.S. military strategy for decades. The lessons learned on those blood-soaked hills would echo through American training grounds, shaping how our own soldiers prepare for the unthinkable. But before the world knew what had happened, before the headlines and the medals, there was only the darkness, the fear, and the question every soldier asks when the odds are stacked against them. Will we hold the line, or will history forget us? In the next few minutes, you'll discover the untold story of Capyong, the night when ordinary men faced the impossible, and the world watched to see if they would break. What happened in that valley would shock the world, and its legacy still shapes the way America remembers the Korean War today. But to understand why this battle mattered so much, and why its story still sends chills down the spine of anyone who hears it, you need to see what those men saw, feel what they felt, and stand with them as the night explodes into chaos. Because what happened next would change everything. To understand why the Battle of Kapyong still echoes through American military history, you have to step back and see just how desperate the situation was in the spring of 1951. The Korean War had already stunned the world. What started as a sudden invasion by North Korea in June 1950 had spiraled into a brutal, seesaw conflict that drew in the United States, China, and the United Nations. American families watched the headlines with a mix of pride and dread as U.S. troops fought halfway across the globe to stop the spread of communism. But by April 1951, the war had reached a terrifying crossroads. The front lines had shifted back and forth so many times that the land itself seemed exhausted. Seoul, the South Korean capital, had already fallen twice. American generals, including the legendary Douglas MacArthur, had once believed victory was within reach, until China unleashed a tidal wave of over 300,000 soldiers, turning the war on its head. The United Nations forces, led by the U.S., were battered, bloodied, and barely holding on. The world's most powerful military machine was suddenly fighting for survival in a place most Americans couldn't even find on a map. Then came the Chinese Fifth Phase Offensive, a military earthquake designed to end the war in one crushing blow. Over 330,000 Chinese troops surged forward along a massive front, aiming to shatter the UN line, recapture Seoul, and force the United States to accept peace on China's terms. The first domino to fall was the South Korean 6th Division, stationed in the Capyong Valley northeast of Seoul. Under the weight of the Chinese onslaught, the division collapsed almost instantly, leaving a gaping hole in the defenses. Through that breach, tens of thousands of enemy soldiers poured south, racing toward the heart of South Korea. And what stood in their way? Not an American armored division, Not a wall of tanks or airstrikes, just two battalions, one Australian, one Canadian, totaling barely 1,600 men. To put that in perspective, that's fewer people than you'd find in a typical American high school, facing an enemy force the size of a small city. The numbers were so lopsided, so brutally unfair, that even the most optimistic U.S. commanders braced for disaster. If the Chinese broke through here, the road to Seoul would be wide open. The fate of the entire Korean peninsula and the credibility of American power in Asia hung by a thread. But wars aren't always decided by numbers. Sometimes, history pivots on the grit of a few determined souls. The Australians dug in on Hill 504, veterans with a reputation for toughness. The Canadians, newer to Korea, held Hill 677 across the valley. Both groups knew the stakes. Both knew that if they failed, the consequences would ripple all the way to Washington. And yet, as the night deepened and the ground began to tremble with the approach of the Chinese army, there was no panic, only the cold, silent resolve of men who understood that sometimes the impossible must be faced head-on. What happened next would test every assumption about courage, loyalty, and the limits of human endurance. The world was about to witness a stand that would become legend, not just in Australia or Canada, but in the halls of the Pentagon and the hearts of every American who believes in holding the line, no matter the odds. But the true test was only beginning. The valley was about to erupt, and the fate of a nation would hang in the balance. Before the first shot was fired in the Capyong Valley, the fate of the Korean War and the reputation of the United States as a global superpower rested on the shoulders of men most Americans had never heard of. But who exactly were these soldiers, suddenly thrust into the path of history? To understand why their stand mattered so much to the U.S. and the world, you have to look beyond the uniforms and see the stories behind the faces. The Australians of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, were no strangers to war. Many had fought in the jungles of New Guinea or the deserts of North Africa during World War II, earning a reputation for toughness and a refusal to back down. Their officers weren't distant figures. They were leaders who had earned the trust of their men in the mud and blood of earlier battles. In the Australian military tradition, respect isn't handed out with a rank. It's earned in the crucible of combat. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson, their commanding officer, was known for his calm under fire and his ability to inspire loyalty. His men would follow him anywhere, but only because he had proven himself time and again. But this wasn't just a story of hardened veterans. The battalion was also filled with young volunteers, men who had grown up hearing stories of American and Allied victories in World War II, and who now wanted to prove themselves on a new battlefield. They carried with them not just weapons and gear, but the weight of expectations from home and the knowledge that the world was watching. For these Australians, the fight in Korea wasn't just about territory. It was about living up to a legacy and standing shoulder to shoulder with American allies in a fight that would define the Cold War. Across the valley, the Canadians of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry were a different mix, but no less formidable. Canada's entry into the Korean War had been slower, more cautious, but when the call finally came, the response was overwhelming. Veterans of World War II, men who had stormed the beaches of Normandy and fought through the ruins of Europe, lined up to serve again, joined by younger recruits eager to test themselves in battle. Their leader, Lieutenant Colonel James Stone, was a legend in his own right, twice decorated for bravery, relentless in training, and utterly focused on preparing his men for the worst. He drilled them hard, demanded perfection, and made it clear that the only acceptable outcome in a defensive battle was to still be standing when the shooting stopped. But beneath the discipline and bravado there was an unspoken tension. These two battalions, Australian and Canadian, had never fought together at this scale. Each wondered in the privacy of their own thoughts what the other would do when the pressure became unbearable. Would the man beside you hold the line, or would he break and run? Every soldier knows his own limits, but no one can predict what an unfamiliar ally will do when the night turns deadly. This uncertainty wasn't lost on American commanders, either. The U.S. military had staked its reputation on the ability of its allies to hold key positions, while American forces regrouped and reinforced. If the Australians or Canadians faltered, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for the men on those hills, but for the entire UN effort in Korea. The stakes were nothing less than the credibility of the United States and its allies in the face of communist aggression. As the sun set on April 22, 1951, the men of Hill 504 and Hill 677 prepared for a night that would test every lesson they'd ever learned, every bond of trust they'd ever formed. They didn't know it yet, but their actions would soon be studied in American war colleges, their courage cited in speeches from the White House, and their legacy woven into the fabric of U.S. military history. But as darkness fell and the first bugles sounded in the distance, all of that faded away. In that moment, there were no headlines, no history books, only the cold ground, the weight of a rifle, and the silent hope that when the world came crashing down, the man beside you would stand his ground. And as the night deepened, the true test of brotherhood and bravery was about to begin. As darkness swallowed the Capyong Valley, the air grew thick with a tension that every American soldier would recognize, the kind that comes just before all hell breaks loose. For the men dug in on those lonely Korean hills, the night was about to become a living nightmare, one that would test the limits of human endurance and redefine what it meant to hold the line. It started with sound, not the distant rumble of artillery or the crack of rifle fire, but something far more primal. Dozens of Chinese bugles screamed out from the blackness, their shrill notes bouncing off the hills and echoing through the valley like a warning from another world. The Americans who later studied this battle would never forget the psychological warfare unleashed that night. The bugles weren't just signals, they were weapons, designed to rattle nerves and sow confusion. And they worked. Every survivor remembered the way those bugles made the earth itself seem to tremble, as if the valley was alive with menace. Then came the drums, low and relentless, pounding through the frozen ground and into the bones of every man on those hills. It was a sound that said, "We are coming, and there is nowhere to hide." For the Australians and Canadians, and for the American commanders listening on the radio, it was the signal that the real fight had begun. Suddenly, the darkness erupted. Waves of Chinese soldiers surged up the slopes, moving with a speed and ferocity that stunned even the most battle-hardened veterans. The Australians on Hill 504 opened fire, their machine guns blazing, the muzzle flashes lighting up faces twisted in determination and fear. The Canadians on Hill 677 faced the same onslaught, their lines bending but refusing to break. The enemy came in wave after wave, each one probing for weakness, each one willing to pay any price to break through. The chaos was total. Communications broke down. In the confusion, friend and foe became impossible to tell apart until they were almost on top of each other. Some positions were overrun, forcing desperate hand-to-hand combat in the dirt and darkness. Men fought with rifles, bayonets, even bare hands, anything to keep the enemy from breaking through. The ground was slick with mud and blood, the air filled with the roar of battle and the screams of the wounded. For the Americans monitoring the situation, the reports coming in were grim. The South Korean division had already collapsed, and now the fate of the entire front seemed to hang on these two battered battalions. If the line broke here, the road to Seoul would be wide open, and the consequences for U.S. strategy in Asia would be catastrophic. The Pentagon watched, waited, and hoped that the men on those hills could do the impossible. But the defenders refused to yield. The Australians, veterans of jungle and desert warfare, fought with a ferocity that stunned even their own officers. The Canadians, many of them World War II veterans, held their ground with a stubbornness that would become legendary. Every inch of ground was contested, every position defended to the last bullet. The Chinese attackers paid dearly for every step they gained, their losses mounting by the hour. As the night wore on, the situation grew more desperate. Ammunition ran low. Communications were cut. Some units were surrounded, fighting in isolation with no hope of reinforcement. Yet still, the line held. The Americans listening and knew that what was happening in the Capyong Valley was more than just a battle. It was a test of will, a crucible that would define the future of the war and the reputation of America's allies. By dawn, the hills were littered with the fallen. The defenders had paid a terrible price, but they were still there. The Chinese had thrown everything they had at the line, but it had not broken. For the United States, the message was clear. When the chips were down, these men, these Australians and Canadians, could be counted on to stand their ground, no matter the cost. But the battle was far from over. The next move would demand a level of courage and sacrifice that would shock even the most seasoned American commanders and change the course of the war forever. As the first gray light crept over the Capyong Valley, the true scale of the disaster facing the United Nations became clear. The Australians, battered and running low on ammunition, had held their ground through a night of relentless assault, but their position was now dangerously exposed. The Chinese had found gaps between platoons, slipping through the lines and threatening to encircle the defenders. For the Americans overseeing the battle, the situation was teetering on the edge of catastrophe. If the line broke now, the road to Seoul would be lost, and with it, the credibility of U.S. power in Asia. The order came down. The Australians would have to withdraw, falling back through the Canadian positions on Hill 677. But as they moved, it became clear that the Canadians were already locked in a desperate fight of their own. The Chinese had struck Hill 677 with the same ferocity, overrunning forward positions and forcing brutal, close-quarters combat. Some Canadian platoons were cut off, surrounded by enemy troops in the darkness, fighting for survival with no way to call for help. It was at this moment, with chaos swirling and the fate of the entire front hanging by a thread, that Lieutenant Colonel James Stone made a decision that would echo through military history. With Chinese soldiers inside his perimeter and his companies isolated from each other, Stone did the unthinkable. He called for artillery fire on his own position. Not near it, on it. He radioed the New Zealand artillery, giving them coordinates that included the very trenches where his men were dug in. For American commanders listening in, this was a moment of almost unimaginable risk. Calling fire on your own troops is a move reserved for the most desperate situations, a last stand when the alternative is total annihilation. But Stone understood the cold arithmetic of war. His men were below ground, protected by the trenches they had spent days digging. The Chinese attackers were exposed, moving in the open. If the artillery was accurate, it would devastate the enemy while sparing most of the defenders. If not, it could wipe out his own battalion. The shells began to fall, shaking the hill with thunderous explosions. At the same time, American tanks from the 72nd Tank Battalion rolled up the valley road, turning their guns upward and blasting the slopes with high-explosive rounds. The combined firepower, artillery from above, tanks from below, and the relentless rifle fire of the Canadians created a storm of steel and shrapnel that tore through the attacking Chinese ranks. For the men on the ground, it was chaos. The earth shook, the air filled with smoke and flying debris. But the line held. The Chinese assault, so overwhelming just hours before, was stopped cold. The Americans monitoring the battle realized they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when leadership, training, and raw courage combined to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But the real story of the turning point wasn't just about firepower. It was about the grit of individual soldiers. Canadian officers crawled through enemy-held ground to restore communications and bring ammunition to isolated platoons. Machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed white-hot, refusing to give an inch. Even as the enemy surged over their positions, the defenders fought on, determined to hold the line no matter the cost. As dawn broke, the hills were littered with the evidence of what had happened. Hundreds of Chinese soldiers lay dead on the slopes, the survivors retreating in disarray. The Canadians, battered but unbroken, were still in their trenches. The Australians, having fought their way through the night, regrouped behind the Canadian lines. Against all odds, the line had held. For the United States, the message was unmistakable. In the darkest hour, when everything seemed lost, America's allies had stood firm. The decision to call fire on their own position, the refusal to break under pressure, and the sheer determination to hold the ground would become legendary, not just in Australia and Canada, but in every American war college and military academy. The Battle of Kapyong had reached its turning point, and the world would never forget what happened on those hills. But the fight was not yet over. The next days would bring new challenges, new sacrifices, and new stories of heroism that would shape the legacy of Capyong for generations to come. In the aftermath of the artillery barrage and the thunder of tank fire, the Capyong Valley was transformed into a landscape of shattered earth and silent testimony. But the true story of this battle, the story that would resonate in American military circles for decades, was written not just in strategy, but in the raw, personal acts of grit and sacrifice that unfolded in the chaos. On Hill 677, as the smoke cleared, the Canadians faced a nightmare scenario. Some platoons were completely surrounded, cut off from the rest of the battalion, with Chinese soldiers inside their trenches. Lieutenant Mike Levy, just 22 years old, found his radio dead and his men isolated. Most would have waited for rescue or given in to panic. Instead, Levy crawled out of his position, moving silently through ground crawling with enemy troops. He reached company headquarters, reported the situation, organized ammunition resupply, and then crawled back the same way, risking his life twice in a single night. His actions would later be studied by American officers as a textbook example of battlefield leadership under fire. Elsewhere on the hill, Corporal William Mitchell, a World War II veteran who had volunteered for Korea, manned his Bren gun until the barrel glowed white-hot. When he ran out of ammunition, he hurled the empty weapon at the enemy and grabbed a rifle from a wounded comrade, refusing to abandon his post. His determination to hold those few feet of ground, no matter the cost, echoed the spirit that American soldiers have always admired in their closest allies. And then there was Private Wayne Mitchell, just 19 years old and facing his first real battle. He later described the experience in words that cut through all the military jargon. "You stop thinking about everything else. You just think about the next 6 feet in front of you. Keep them clear. Keep them clear." For every American who has ever wondered what courage looks like in the heat of battle, Mitchell's words are a reminder that heroism is often simple, silent, and relentless. Meanwhile, the Australians, battered and exhausted, withdrew through the Canadian lines. As they passed, they could hear the sounds of Hill 677 still holding, rifles firing, artillery crashing, the unmistakable noise of men refusing to give up. For many Australians, it was a moment of revelation. They had wondered if these Canadians would stand firm when the world seemed to be collapsing. Now, seeing them bloodied but unbroken, they understood. These were men you could trust with your life. This mutual respect was not lost on the Americans watching from afar. The U.S. military had always valued allies who could be counted on in the worst situations. What happened at Capyong became a benchmark, a story told in American war colleges, a lesson in what it means to fight alongside partners who will not break, no matter how fierce the storm. But the cost was staggering. The Australians counted 32 dead and 59 wounded after the first night alone. The Canadians, though suffering fewer casualties, had endured a trial by fire that would leave scars for a lifetime. The Chinese attackers, expecting an easy victory, left behind hundreds of their own dead on the slopes, a grim testament to the price of underestimating determined defenders. For the United States, the message was clear. In the darkest hours, when the odds are impossible and the world is watching, true allies reveal themselves not in words, but in action. The acts of grit and sacrifice at Capyong would ripple through American military thinking for generations, shaping how the U.S. chose its friends and how it prepared for the battles yet to come. But as the sun rose over the battered hills, the story of Capyong was far from over. The next days would bring new challenges, deeper bonds, and a legacy that would stretch from the valleys of Korea all the way to the heart of America. When the guns finally fell silent over the Kapyong Valley, the world had changed in ways that would ripple far beyond the hills of Korea. For the Americans watching from command posts and war rooms, the outcome was nothing short of astonishing. Against all odds, the line had held. The Australians and Canadians, outnumbered and nearly overwhelmed, had stopped the largest Chinese offensive of the war dead in its tracks. The road to Seoul remained closed, and the fate of South Korea, and the credibility of American power in Asia, had been preserved by the courage of a few determined allies. The immediate aftermath was a blur of exhaustion and reckoning. The Australians mourned their 32 dead and 59 wounded, each loss a heavy burden for their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ferguson. The Canadians, battered but still in their trenches, counted 10 killed and 23 wounded over 3 nights of relentless combat. For the Chinese, the cost was staggering, over 1,000 casualties on Hill 677 alone, and hundreds more on the Australian side. The math was brutal, but the message was clear. Determined defenders, even when outnumbered, could inflict devastating losses on a superior force. But the impact of Capyong didn't end with casualty reports. The battle sent shockwaves through the highest levels of U.S. command. American generals realized that the Commonwealth units had not only held their ground, but had done so with a level of discipline and coordination that rivaled the best American formations. The decision by Lieutenant Colonel Stone to call artillery on his own position became a case study in U.S. military academies, a lesson in calculated risk, trust in training, and the power of leadership under fire. Strategically, Capyong bought the United Nations precious time. The Chinese Fifth Phase Offensive, designed to break the back of the UN line and force a negotiated peace on China's terms, had failed. Reinforcements rushed in, the front was stabilized, and Seoul was saved from a third occupation. General James Van Fleet, commander of the U.S. Eighth Army, later credited the stand at Capyong as one of the key moments that turned the tide of the war. For American policymakers, it was proof that the alliance system could work, that the U.S. was not alone in the fight against communist expansion. The ripple effect extended beyond the battlefield. In the months and years that followed, the lessons of Capyong were woven into American military doctrine. The importance of well-prepared defensive positions, the value of multinational cooperation, and the necessity of trusting allies in the heat of battle became cornerstones of U.S. strategy. The story of Capyong was told and retold in American war colleges, shaping the way future generations of officers thought about leadership, courage, and the unpredictable nature of war. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the men who fought there, and on the nations that sent them. For the Australians and Canadians, Capyong became a symbol of what it meant to stand with America in the darkest hour. For the United States, it was a reminder that true allies are forged not in treaties, but in the crucible of shared sacrifice. As the dust settled and the wounded were tended, a quiet sense of pride spread through the ranks. The Americans who had watched the battle unfold knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The stand at Capyong was more than a military victory. It was a testament to the power of unity, the strength of resolve, and the enduring value of standing shoulder to shoulder when the world is on the line. But the legacy of Capyong was just beginning. The memory of those nights would echo through history, shaping alliances, inspiring soldiers, and reminding America that sometimes the fate of nations turns on the courage of a few. Long after the last shots faded over the Kapyong Valley, the legacy of that desperate stand continued to shape the world, especially for Americans who understood that history is written not just by nations, but by the courage of individuals. The story of Capyong became more than a chapter in military textbooks. It became a living lesson in what it means to stand firm when everything is on the line. For the United States, the memory of Capyong was woven into the fabric of Cold War strategy. American commanders studied the battle, drawing lessons about the power of coalition warfare and the necessity of trusting allies in the most critical moments. The decision by Lieutenant Colonel Stone to call artillery on his own position became a legendary example in U.S. military academies, a reminder that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to a single, impossible choice made in the heat of battle. American officers would reference Capyong for decades, teaching new generations that true leadership means making the hard call, even when the risks are almost unthinkable. But the legacy of Capyong wasn't just about tactics or strategy. It was about the bonds forged in fire, bonds that would endure long after the war ended. The Australians and Canadians who fought side by side with American forces became more than just allies. They became brothers in arms. The respect earned on those hills would echo through every joint operation, every peacekeeping mission, and every moment when the United States needed to know who would stand with them when the world turned dark. In the years that followed, the story of Capyong was honored in ceremonies and memorials across the globe. In the United States, the battle became a symbol of what America values most in its partners: resilience, loyalty, and the willingness to sacrifice for a cause greater than oneself. The Presidential Unit Citation, awarded to both the Australian and Canadian battalions, was a rare and powerful recognition from the U.S. military, a statement that what happened at Capyong mattered not just to those who fought there, but to the entire American nation. The lessons of Capyong also shaped how the U.S. approached future conflicts. From Vietnam to Afghanistan, American commanders remembered the importance of well-prepared defenses, the value of multinational cooperation, and the need to trust in the training and resolve of every soldier on the line. The battle's legacy lived on in every joint exercise, every coalition mission, and every moment when American troops stood shoulder to shoulder with their allies, knowing that history could turn on a single night of courage. But perhaps the most enduring meaning of Capyong lies in the quiet moments, when veterans returned to those hills decades later, standing in silence as they remembered friends who never came home. For American families, the story of Capyong is a reminder that freedom is never free, and that the cost of holding the line is measured not just in victories, but in the lives forever changed by war. Today, the Capyong Valley is peaceful, its hills green and quiet. But for those who know its story, especially in the United States, it remains a place of honor, a symbol of what can be achieved when nations unite in the face of overwhelming odds. The memory of Capyong is a call to remember, to honor, and to never forget the price paid by those who stood their ground when the world needed them most. And as long as Americans value courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood, the legacy of Capyong will never fade. The story of Capyong is more than a tale of military tactics or battlefield heroics. It's a living testament to the values that define America and its closest allies. In the cold, unforgiving darkness of April 1951, when the world seemed to be collapsing and the odds were stacked against them, a handful of Australians and Canadians stood their ground. Their courage didn't just save a valley in Korea. It helped preserve the freedom of an entire nation and sent a message that still resonates in every corner of the United States military. For Americans, the lessons of Capyong are as relevant today as they were more than 70 years ago. The battle proved that alliances matter, that when the United States stands with partners who share its values and its resolve, there is no force on earth that can break that line. The grit shown by those Commonwealth soldiers became a benchmark for what America expects from its friends and what it demands from itself. In every joint operation, every coalition mission, And every moment when American troops face the unknown, the spirit of Capyong is there. A reminder that unity, sacrifice, and unwavering determination can turn the tide of history. But Capyong's legacy isn't just about military strategy or international politics. It's about the human cost of freedom. It's about the young men who never came home, the families who waited for news, and the veterans who carried the memories of that night for the rest of their lives. It's about the quiet pride that comes from knowing you stood your ground when the world said you couldn't. For every American who has ever wondered what it means to serve, to sacrifice, or to stand shoulder to shoulder with allies in the darkest hour, Capyong offers an answer written in courage and sealed in blood. Today, as the United States faces new challenges and uncertain futures, the story of Capyong remains a guiding light. It reminds us that freedom is never guaranteed, that the cost of peace is always high, and that the bonds forged in battle are unbreakable. The hills of Capyong are quiet now, but their legacy lives on, in the training grounds of American soldiers, in the alliances that keep the world safe, and in the hearts of everyone who believes that some things are worth fighting for. So the next time you hear about the Korean War, remember Capyong. Remember the night when the world held its breath and a handful of determined allies stood firm against the darkness. Remember that the strength of America is not just in its weapons or its wealth, but in the courage of those who stand with us when it matters most. Because in the end, the true measure of a nation is not how it stands in moments of comfort, but how it endures in moments of crisis. And at Capyong, America and its allies prove to the world that when everything is on the line, they will still be there, unbroken, unyielding, and unforgettable.